Remember when a horror film hired a real-life amputee, fitted him with fake arms, and then had a monster bite those arms clean off on camera? And that was just one afternoon's work on a production so punishing it nearly killed the 22-year-old genius behind its effects? The film was savaged by critics, buried by a friendly alien named E.T. that same summer, and dismissed as instant garbage. Today, it's regarded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. This is The Thing, John Carpenter's 1982 masterpiece starring Kurt Russell and Wilford Brimley, with creature effects by the legendary Rob Bottin. It strands a dozen American researchers at an Antarctic outpost with a shape-shifting alien that perfectly imitates anything it kills, meaning any one of them could already be the monster, and nobody can tell. Today, we're counting down 20 insane facts critics missed in 1982, and stick around for number one because the film's notorious ending has been argued about for over 40 years, and Carpenter himself has now admitted there's a hidden clue that settles it. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. At the end of this film, who's still human? Make your case below. Alright, nobody trusts anybody now. Let's get into it. One of the most shocking moments in The Thing is the defibrillator scene. Dr. Copper attempts to restart the heart of a man named Norris who has collapsed, and as Copper presses the paddles down onto Norris's chest, the chest splits open into an enormous fanged mouth and bites both of Copper's arms off at the elbow. It is sudden, grotesque, and completely convincing, and the way the filmmakers achieved it is the perfect introduction to how this film thought about realism. They hired a real-life double amputee. The production found a performer who was missing both forearms, fitted him with a mask made to look like the face of actor Richard Dysart, who played Copper, and built fake prosthetic forearms onto his stumps. When the chest mouth slams shut and tears the arms away, what you're watching is a real man with no arms, wearing breakaway fake ones designed to be ripped off. There was nothing to fake about the absence of the limbs because the limbs genuinely weren't there. It's a piece of casting so dark and so clever it borders on uncomfortable, and it set the standard for the entire production. Whenever the real thing would sell the horror better than a trick, Carpenter and Bottin used the real thing. The mastermind behind the creatures in The Thing, the shape-shifting horrors that have terrified audiences for over 4 decades and are still studied by effects artists today, was Rob Bottin, and when he did this work, he was just 22 years old. He had come to the project fresh off the werewolf transformations in The Howling and earlier work with Carpenter on The Fog. He was, by the accounts of everyone on the production, a genuine prodigy, whip-smart, wildly imaginative, and almost frighteningly committed to his craft. It was Bottin, not Carpenter, who conceived the single most important idea in the entire film. Carpenter originally imagined The Thing as one fixed creature, a single monster. Bottin pitched something far stranger, that the thing could look like anything, that it had traveled across the galaxy assimilating countless species, and that out of its changing shape it could call up any horror from any world it had ever consumed. Carpenter initially found the concept too weird, then he embraced it completely, and it became the defining nightmare logic of the film. A 22-year-old talked one of horror's master directors into rebuilding his entire monster, and the result changed special effects forever. Rob Bottin's commitment to The Thing went so far past healthy that it became genuinely dangerous. By multiple accounts, Bottin essentially moved into the studio. He stopped going home. He worked 7 days a week for stretches reportedly hitting 22-hour days for something on the order of 57 weeks, more than a full year, without a single day off, often performing the most difficult and delicate effects work himself rather than delegating it. He survived on junk food and almost no sleep, surrounded by a loyal crew who tried to keep him going. The human body cannot sustain that, and Bottin's didn't. By the end of the production, he collapsed and was hospitalized with a brutal combination of ailments, severe exhaustion, double pneumonia, and a bleeding ulcer. The young man who had reinvented movie monsters had quite literally worked himself into a hospital bed in the process. When you watch The Thing and marvel at how alive and impossible its creatures feel, you're looking at the work of someone who sacrificed his physical health to make them. A person who poured so much of himself into the film that it nearly became the last thing he ever did. The monsters cost him his body for a year. When Bottin became too overwhelmed and ill to handle everything, the production needed someone to take on one of the film's most pivotal effects sequences. The kennel scene, where the alien, disguised as a sled dog, first reveals itself, its body splitting open into a writhing flower of tentacles and teeth among the other terrified dogs. The man who stepped in to create this creature was Stan Winston, who would go on to become perhaps the most celebrated special effects artist in Hollywood history. winning multiple Academy Awards for Aliens, Terminator 2, and Jurassic Park. Winston did extraordinary work on the dog thing, and then he did something extraordinary off camera. He refused to take official screen credit for it. Winston had such respect for Rob Bottin and such an understanding of how completely this film was Bottin's artistic achievement that he insisted all the glory go to the younger man alone. He accepted only a small thank you tucked into the end credits. One of the biggest names in the history of the craft built one of the film's signature monsters and then deliberately stepped out of the spotlight so that a 22-year-old could keep all of it. There was, fittingly, an irony Bottin appreciated. He was so sick of building mechanical dogs after The Howling that he was relieved to hand this one off. In the pursuit of total realism, Rob Bottin's team initially planned to use genuine animal organs, purchased from a slaughterhouse, for the film's gruesome autopsy and dissection scenes, where characters cut into the assimilated remains of the thing's victims. Real viscera, real guts, real organ meat used to sell the horror of a human body turned inside out by the alien. According to John Carpenter, the only member of the cast who wasn't visibly squeamish working around all this real awful was Wilford Brimley, the mustached character actor who played the doomed scientist Blair. The plan to use real organs led to one of the production's grimmest and funniest disasters. A box of the raw slaughterhouse meat was absent-mindedly left at the back of a soundstage at Universal and simply forgotten. About a week later, a studio employee discovered it, by which point the entire stage, in his memorable complaint, smelled appallingly of rot. The genuine organs were largely abandoned as a working method after that, replaced by Bottin's arsenal of fabricated gore. But the impulse tells you everything about the film's ethos. When the choice was between a convincing fake and the genuinely disgusting real thing, the instinct, again and again, was to reach for the real thing until it started to stink up the studio. For all the talk of real organs, the overwhelming majority of the thing's legendary gore was concocted from a shopping list that sounds more like a chaotic breakfast than a horror arsenal. Bottin's crew built the film's slime, viscera, and oozing transformations out of an astonishing mixture of ordinary kitchen ingredients. Heated bubblegum, strawberry jam, mayonnaise, creamed corn, gelatin, and food thickener, combined with synthetic materials like foam latex, fiberglass, rubber, and large quantities of KY jelly to give everything that wet, glistening, just born sheen. This is part of what makes the film's effects so timeless, because they were real. Physical substances, photographed in real light, they have a tactile, gooey, three-dimensional presence that computer effects have never quite managed to replicate. The Blair thing in the film's finale alone required around 300 pounds of foam rubber to construct. There's something wonderfully absurd in knowing that some of the most disturbing images in horror history were sculpted from condiments and candy, that the nightmare oozing across the screen is, at its core, jam and mayonnaise and chewing gum, lit and shot by artists who understood that the human eye believes texture it can almost smell. The horror is real because the goo was real. The set of The Thing was not free of friction, and one particular incident reveals just how tense things could get. 3 of the actors, Richard Masur, David Clennon, and Thomas Waits, had pitched John Carpenter an idea for a scene in which their characters would conspire against the rest of the group. Carpenter rejected the idea. The 3 actors were frustrated enough by the rejection that they walked off and began venting about it, ranting about Carpenter, cursing him and his judgment in what they assumed was a private conversation. It was not private. Their microphones were still live, and Carpenter could hear every word they were saying. He let them go on for about 10 minutes, listening to the entire tirade against him, before calmly approaching the 3 of them and informing them that he'd heard the whole thing. One can only imagine the silence that followed. It's a small, very human moment of behind-the-scenes awkwardness on a production otherwise dominated by monsters and slime. A reminder that beneath the groundbreaking horror, this was a set full of stressed, exhausted people, occasionally at odds, occasionally forgetting that in a film production, something is almost always still recording. If you watch The Thing closely, you'll notice that Keith David's character, Childs, wears gloves through much of the film. This wasn't entirely a costume choice dictated by the Antarctic setting. Before or during the production, Keith David was in a car accident and broke one of his hands, which had to be put in a cast. Rather than recast or rework the role, the production simply kept Childs in gloves wherever possible to conceal the cast underneath, working around a real injury without ever drawing attention to it. This detail carries an unexpected weight given the film's ending, which we'll get to. Childs is one of the 2 men left alive in the final scene. one of the two candidates for being secretly assimilated by the Thing, and decades of fans have scrutinized every frame of his final moments looking for clues. And underneath the gloves that have fed some of that scrutiny, the real answer to at least one mystery is mundane: a broken hand and a hidden cast. It's a reminder that some of what viewers read as deliberate, sinister filmmaking choices are simply the practical accidents of a difficult shoot, quietly absorbed into the fabric of the film. The iconic theatrical poster for The Thing, the image of a figure standing in the snow with blinding white light erupting from where its head should be, is widely regarded as a classic of movie poster art. It was created by Drew Struzan, considered by many the greatest film poster artist who ever lived, the hand behind the legendary posters for Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, and countless others. And his work on The Thing came together under almost comically constrained circumstances. According to accounts of its creation, Struzan designed and drew the entire poster in roughly 24 hours, and he did it essentially blind, without having any real knowledge of the film itself. He wasn't working from a finished cut or a deep understanding of the story. He was handed a brief and a deadline and produced in a single day one of the most enduring horror images in marketing history. The eerie, faceless, light-blasted figure perfectly captures the film's themes of hidden identity and the unknowable, a being whose true nature is literally obscured. And Struzan arrived at it almost by instinct, in a day with little to go on. Sometimes genius doesn't need the briefing. The Thing was released on June 25th, 1982 into one of the most brutal pieces of timing in film history. Just 2 weeks earlier, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial had opened. A warm, gentle, life-affirming story about a lovable alien who befriends a child, which became a cultural phenomenon and one of the most beloved films ever made. Audiences in the summer of 1982 wanted to be comforted by their alien. Carpenter offered them the exact opposite: a paranoid, nihilistic, body horror nightmare about an alien that murders you and wears your skin. The collision was catastrophic for The Thing. There was, it turned out, only room for one extraterrestrial in the hearts of summer audiences, and they had already chosen the friendly one. The Thing was panned by critics, some of whom called it instant junk, a soulless exercise in gore, and it underperformed at the box office. Carpenter has said the film's failure was the most painful of his career, hitting him harder than any other flop. He even lost a chance to direct another project over it. The film that would one day be hailed as a masterpiece arrived in the wrong summer, against the wrong alien, and was left for dead. It took years for the world to realize what it actually had. If you're enjoying these, and if you've now started eyeing everyone in the room wondering which of them is The Thing, hit the like button and subscribe so more people find this. Drop a comment. What's the single most disturbing practical effect in this entire film? Make your case below. Alright, back to the ice. For the film's music, John Carpenter, who famously scored most of his own films with stark electronic music, did something unexpected. He flew to Rome to personally convince Ennio Morricone, one of the greatest film composers who has ever lived, the maestro behind the Sergio Leone westerns, to score The Thing. It was a coup. Carpenter wanted the film to have a European musical sensibility, and he landed one of the absolute masters of the form to provide it. And then he barely used what Morricone gave him. Morricone, unsure exactly what Carpenter wanted, composed an enormous amount of music, a full orchestral score, a full synthesizer score, and combinations of the two, around an hour of material in total. Carpenter ended up using very little of it, gravitating instead toward a spare, pulsing, synth-driven main theme that sounded so much like Carpenter's own style that many viewers assumed Carpenter wrote it himself. Morricone was reportedly baffled, asking Carpenter why he'd hired him at all if he wanted to do it himself. Carpenter even composed and inserted some additional synth pieces of his own to fill small gaps. He recruited a legend and then largely set his work aside, a decision that would have a remarkable second act decades later. Here's the astonishing payoff to the Morricone story. All that gorgeous, operatic, orchestral music that Ennio Morricone composed for The Thing and that Carpenter largely declined to use didn't simply vanish. It sat, released on a soundtrack album, but essentially never heard in any actual film for more than 30 years. Then Quentin Tarantino came calling. When Tarantino hired Morricone to score his 2015 snowbound, paranoid, single-location western, The Hateful Eight, a film openly modeled in part on The Thing, the composer was pressed for time. So he offered Tarantino a shortcut. use the unused music he'd written for The Thing decades earlier. Tarantino did exactly that. Several cues Morricone had composed for The Thing in 1982, including tracks that had never appeared in any movie, were folded into the score of The Hateful Eight. And that score went on to win Ennio Morricone the Academy Award for Best Original Score, his first competitive Oscar, awarded when he was in his late 80s. The dark irony is exquisite. Back in 1982, Morricone's music for The Thing was nominated for a Razzie, a mock award for the worst score of the year. The very same body of work, finally heard decades later, helped win him an Oscar. Rejected, mocked, shelved, and then crowned. One of the most counterintuitive techniques behind The Thing's enduring effectiveness is that the film's cinematographer, Dean Cundey, worked deliberately to keep you from seeing the creatures too clearly. Rob Bottin was intensely protective of his creations and acutely worried about any shot that might reveal them as rubber and latex rather than living horror, so Cundey developed an entire lighting philosophy around concealment. Tiny, precise pools of light and surrounding pockets of shadow, designed so the audience never got a flat, clear, head-on look at any creature that might break the spell. This restraint is a huge part of why the effects still hold up. By lighting the monsters in fragments, a gleam of teeth here, a glistening tendril there, the rest swallowed by darkness, Cundey let the audience's imagination assemble something far more horrifying and far more believable than full illumination could ever provide. The viewer's mind fills the shadows with the worst possibilities. It's the same principle that drives the entire film's horror. The terror of what you cannot quite see, what might be hidden, what could be lurking just outside the light. The creatures are masterpieces, but Cundey understood that showing them too plainly would diminish them. He hid the art to protect the fear. In the film's opening stretch, before the horror fully erupts, we see MacReady playing chess against a computer. And when the machine beats him, he pours his whiskey into its circuitry to short it out, muttering at it. That talking chess computer has a voice, a smooth feminine voice that taunts the player, and that voice belongs to Adrienne Barbeau, the actress who was, at the time, married to John Carpenter and who had appeared in his films The Fog and Escape from New York. It's an uncredited, easily missed cameo. Barbeau never appears on screen. She's only a disembodied voice emanating from a chess machine in the first few minutes of an otherwise entirely male film. But it's a charming piece of trivia that rewards close listeners, a tiny hidden presence in a film obsessed with hidden presences. In a movie where nothing and no one is quite what they appear to be, where the central horror is that an identity can be a disguise, there's something quietly fitting about the director's own wife being secretly embedded in the machinery of the outpost. Recognizable only to those who already know her voice, The Thing imitates. So, in a gentler way, does the casting. The single most important performer in the film's masterful opening sequence isn't human. It's a dog. Specifically, the dog that appears to be an innocent husky fleeing across the Antarctic snow, pursued by Norwegians in a helicopter who are desperately trying to kill it, before it's taken in by the unsuspecting Americans. That dog, of course, is not a dog at all, but the thing itself, and the entire eerie tension of the opening depends on the animal's uncanny, watchful, too intelligent presence. The dog was named Jed, and he was a wolf-dog hybrid. By every account, Jed was an astonishingly disciplined animal actor. He reportedly never once glanced at the camera, the dolly, or the crew during filming, never broke the illusion, never behaved like a pet aware it was being watched, which is precisely what gave his performance that unsettling, alert, knowing quality. He simply did his job with eerie focus, which is a large part of why the opening works so well. There's a small twist too. The specific dog seen running from the helicopter in some shots wasn't actually Jed, but another dog painted to resemble him more closely. The Thing, fittingly, was being imitated by an imitation, even at the level of the animals. The Thing opens with a scene that most American audiences experience as pure chaos. A helicopter chases a dog across the snow, and a frantic Norwegian man is shouting and shooting at the animal, his words untranslated, sounding to English-speaking viewers like the ravings of a lunatic trying to kill an innocent husky. It plays as baffling and a little unhinged, which is the point. The Americans at the outpost interpret it exactly the same way and shoot the Norwegian in apparent self-defense. But the Norwegian dialogue is not gibberish, and it isn't random. Translated, the man is screaming a genuine warning, frantically trying to tell the Americans that the thing they're looking at is not a dog, that it's something pretending to be a dog, and that they must get away from it. He isn't insane. He's the only person in the scene who understands exactly what's happening, desperately trying to save the lives of people who can't understand his language and assume he's dangerous. For viewers who speak Norwegian or who later learn the translation, the entire opening transforms. The crazy man was right about everything. The Americans killed the one person trying to warn them and welcomed the monster inside. The tragedy was hidden in plain sight, in a language nobody bothered to translate. The Thing is often discussed as a wholly original nightmare, but it's a remake, and the source meant a great deal to John Carpenter personally. The film is based on the 1938 novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell Jr., but more directly, it revisits the 1951 science fiction film The Thing from Another World, which Carpenter had loved as a child. That earlier film is even referenced directly within Carpenter's own work. In his blockbuster Halloween, characters are shown watching The Thing from Another World on television, but Carpenter had always been bothered by one thing about the 1951 version: its monster. In the older film, the alien is essentially a humanoid figure, famously, a guy in a suit closer to Frankenstein's monster than to anything truly alien. Carpenter felt this betrayed the genuinely frightening premise of the original novella, which centered on a creature that could perfectly imitate any living thing, making it impossible to know who was human. His entire mission with the 1982 film was to finally do justice to that core idea: the shapeshifter, the imitator, the paranoia of hidden identity that the beloved film of his childhood had set aside. He wasn't just remaking a movie, he was correcting it. Normally, a film's script is locked and the effects are built to serve it. The Thing frequently worked the other way around. As production progressed and Rob Bottin and his crew dreamed up increasingly outrageous, impossible, brilliant creature ideas, the screenplay was repeatedly reworked to accommodate the effects rather than the reverse. Some of the film's most unforgettable moments, the chest mouth, the grotesque spider head that detaches from a body and skitters away, emerged from the effects team's imagination first, and the story bent to include them. There's a specific and almost funny reason one major scene exists at all. Carpenter wanted to be sure his editor, Todd Ramsey, fully understood the logic of how the Thing assimilated its victims. So he asked Ramsey to explain the creature's biology back to him. Ramsey explained it and got it wrong, realizing that if his own editor was confused, audiences would be hopelessly lost. Carpenter added an additional scene specifically to clarify how the Thing absorbs and replicates a life form. A misunderstanding by a single crew member directly produced a scene in the finished film. The movie was, in a real sense, being reverse engineered around its own monsters and its own confusions, built to chase whatever nightmare Bottin conjured next. The Thing is the opening chapter of what John Carpenter himself has termed his Apocalypse trilogy, 3 thematically linked films about humanity facing annihilation by vast, ancient, incomprehensible forces. The Thing came first in 1982, followed by Prince of Darkness in 1987, a film about an ancient evil contained in a church basement, and concluding with In the Mouth of Madness in 1994, a film about a horror novelist whose creations bleed into reality. The 3 films share no characters or plot, but they share a worldview, bleak, cosmic, and deeply pessimistic about humanity's odds. What links them most powerfully is the sense that the human characters are not heroes, destined to triumph but small, fragile beings, confronting something far larger and older than themselves, something that regards them with no malice and no mercy, merely as material. The Thing establishes this tone perfectly. The alien isn't evil in any human sense, it simply imitates and consumes because that is its nature, the way a virus spreads. Carpenter described his own creature as not necessarily evil, just a thing whose nature is to imitate. That cold, indifferent, world-ending vision is the thread running through all 3 films, and The Thing is where Carpenter first stared fully into that abyss. For over 40 years, audiences have argued about the final scene of The Thing. The outpost is destroyed, and 2 survivors, Macready and Childs, sit exhausted in the burning wreckage in the freezing cold, each silently wondering if the other is secretly the Thing. The film simply ends there, on that unbearable note of mutual suspicion, never telling you whether either man, both men, or neither is human. It is one of the most famous ambiguous endings in cinema, and Carpenter deliberately fought to keep it, rejecting test-screened alternate endings, including one where Macready is shown to be safe, and a cheerful version where the survivors are rescued. He found them too shallow and unheroic. For decades, Carpenter's answer to who's human was a flat refusal. The point is that you can't know, and that's the horror. Fans built elaborate theories anyway. That you can't see Childs' breath in the frigid air, suggesting he's the thing. That cinematographer Dean Cundey deliberately put a glint of light in the eyes of uninfected characters and left it absent from Childs. That since the alien can't replicate inorganic objects, Childs still wearing his earring proves he's human. The debate never ended, and then, more recently, Carpenter shifted, acknowledging that the film actually does contain a major hint that resolves the question, a clue planted for those paying close enough attention. After a lifetime of insisting there was no answer, the director suggested there was one hiding in plain sight all along. So watch it again. The solution to the most debated ending in horror history may have been sitting right in front of you the entire time, waiting in the dark for you to notice it. So there you have it. 20 facts the critics missed in 1982 about a film that bit the arms off a real amputee, nearly killed its 22-year-old effects genius, built its nightmares from jam and mayonnaise, and was buried alive by a friendly alien before rising decades later as a masterpiece. Its rejected music won an Oscar. Its crazy Norwegian was right all along. And its ending may not be unsolvable after all.